Story 1.
One evening, feeling a bit restless after work, I decided to explore a part of town I didn't frequent often. There, nestled on a quiet street corner, I found a small cafe. Its warm lighting and rustic charm drew me in. Despite its inviting atmosphere, something about the place felt off. As I scanned the room, I noticed one odd detail. There was a table in the far corner that was always empty. Even as the cafe filled with patrons, that particular table remained vacant. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was reserved for some regular customer or perhaps out of order. But something about the way the staff subtly avoided it caught my attention. My curiosity piqued, and when the waitress approached to take my order, I decided to ask about it. "Can I sit there?" I pointed to the empty table. The waitress froze for a moment, her smile faltering. "I wouldn't recommend it," she said, glancing nervously toward the kitchen. "Please, take any other seat." When I pressed her for a reason, she avoided my gaze, quickly redirecting the conversation to what I'd like to drink. Her reaction only fueled my curiosity, but I decided to let it go for the moment. I sat at a different table, keeping the strange one in the corner in my peripheral vision. Throughout my meal, I couldn't help but glance over at it. The table seemed perfectly ordinary, just another wooden surface with two chairs. Still, the tension in the air around it was palpable. The cafe bustled with life, yet no one paid any attention to the corner table. I watched as other patrons eyed it briefly but quickly looked away. It was almost as if they too sensed something strange. As I finished my meal, I overheard a hushed conversation between the waitress and the cook at the counter. They spoke in low voices, but one phrase stood out: "The ones who sit there, they disappear." That sentence lingered in my mind as I paid for my meal and left the cafe. Disappear? What could she have meant by that? I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in my chest. My walk home was slower than usual, and for the first time in a while, I felt genuinely uneasy. I spent the next few days thinking about the cafe and its mysterious table. The more I thought about it, the more absurd the whole situation seemed. People don't just disappear, I told myself. Maybe it was just a local urban legend or a strange superstition among the staff. But the fact that no one had given me a straight answer gnawed at me. By the end of the week, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I decided to return to the cafe. This time, I was determined to sit at that table, no matter what the waitress or anyone else said. I needed to see for myself if there was any truth to the strange rumors. As I walked through the cafe's door, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. The cafe looked the same as before, warm, inviting, and cozy. But my eyes immediately went to the empty corner table. It was still there, untouched. I approached it, my heart pounding a little faster than usual. The waitress spotted me and hurried over, a worried expression on her face. "Please," she said softly, "sit anywhere else." I shook my head, smiling to mask the nervousness that was creeping in. "No, I'll sit here tonight," I replied, pulling out the chair. The waitress looked uneasy, her fingers trembling as she handed me the menu. She didn't say another word, just gave a slight nod before retreating to the kitchen. Her reaction only made me more determined. I sat down, and for a while, nothing happened. I tried to relax, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The cafe hummed with the usual sounds of clinking dishes, quiet chatter, and the hiss of the espresso machine. I even began to think I had let my imagination run wild. But just as I took a sip of my coffee, a cold sensation crawled up my leg. Startled, I glanced down, expecting to see something under the table, maybe a stray breeze or an air vent blowing cold air. But there was nothing. The chill intensified, and I suddenly felt as if someone was watching me. I looked around, but no one was paying attention to me. The cafe was just as it had been moments ago, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on my meal, but the cold sensation wouldn't leave. It was as though something was brushing against my leg, deliberate, insistent. I tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling grew stronger. My stomach knotted with a mix of fear and curiosity. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something under the table? Slowly, I bent down to look, half expecting to see something tangible, but the space was empty. I sat up quickly, my heart racing now. The cold persisted, almost like an icy hand grazing my skin. I glanced at the waitress, but she avoided my gaze, her face pale as she cleared a nearby table. I couldn't sit still any longer. I stood up abruptly, knocking over my chair in the process. The cafe went quiet for a moment as everyone looked in my direction. Embarrassed, I muttered an apology and quickly gathered my things, deciding it was best to leave. As I made my way toward the door, I could feel the eyes of the staff on my back, but no one said a word. The moment I stepped outside, the chill vanished, leaving me confused and unsettled. The warmth of the evening air did little to calm the gnawing sense of dread that clung to me. I walked home, trying to rationalize what had happened, but my mind kept returning to that cold, unsettling touch under the table. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over the experience. Why had the waitress been so insistent on me sitting elsewhere? And what was that sensation I felt? The more I thought about it, the more I wanted answers. I needed to go back and figure out what was happening in that cafe. So, the following weekend, I made up my mind. I would return to the cafe one last time, and this time, I wouldn't leave until I understood the mystery of that table. My decision wasn't without hesitation, but curiosity had always been my weakness. I couldn't let it go, not without knowing the truth. When I entered the cafe again, I noticed the same familiar atmosphere, friendly patrons, warm lighting, and that empty table in the corner, still untouched. I walked directly to it without hesitation, ignoring the anxious glances from the staff. The waitress hurried over, looking more frightened than before. "You don't want to do this," she whispered urgently, but I shook my head. "I need to know," I said firmly. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between me and the table, but eventually, she stepped back, offering no further protest. I sat down, bracing myself for whatever might happen next. Minutes passed, and nothing out of the ordinary occurred. I started to feel foolish, like I was chasing a ghost that didn't exist. But just as I began to relax, the cold sensation returned, this time stronger than before. It was no longer just a chill on my leg, it felt like something was actively touching me, pressing against my skin. I froze, every instinct in me screaming to get up and leave, but I forced myself to stay seated. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to run now. The cold spread, creeping up my legs and into my chest, making it hard to breathe. I glanced around, hoping someone would notice my distress, but the other patrons were oblivious. Suddenly, I felt a pressure on my shoulder, as if a hand had rested there for a brief moment. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, but no one was near me. The waitress stood by the counter, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes, but she didn't move. It was clear she knew something, but whatever it was, she wasn't going to tell me. I tried to focus on my food, hoping to distract myself, but the sensation wouldn't go away. It was as though the air around me had thickened, making it difficult to move, to think clearly. The cafe's once warm and inviting atmosphere had become oppressive, suffocating. I realized then that I had made a mistake. The cold sensation grew stronger, and soon, I could no longer ignore it. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. Something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that I needed to leave, now. I pushed my chair back, preparing to stand, but before I could, the pressure on my shoulder intensified. It felt like a hand, cold, firm, and inhuman. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place. My breathing grew shallow as the room around me began to blur, the sounds of the cafe fading into a distant hum. It was as though the world was slipping away, leaving me alone in the grip of something unseen. Finally, with a tremendous effort, I broke free of the paralysis and stumbled to my feet. The coldness receded instantly, leaving me gasping for breath. The patrons in the cafe hadn't noticed a thing, continuing their meals as though nothing had happened. But I could feel the weight of something watching me, lurking just out of sight. I staggered toward the door, my pulse racing. Every step felt like a struggle, but I had to get out. As I reached the exit, the cold sensation began to fade, and by the time I stepped outside, it was gone entirely. The night air was warm against my skin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I walked home quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure trailing behind. But the streets were empty, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, gnawing at my nerves. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that cold hand on my shoulder, and the oppressive weight of its presence. I had thought I could handle whatever was happening in that cafe, but now I wasn't so sure. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I had this sinking feeling that I was in way over my head. The following day, I woke up groggy, the events of the previous night still vivid in my mind. I had convinced myself that what I felt at the cafe had been a trick of my imagination, a reaction to the eerie atmosphere, the rumors, and perhaps my own curiosity. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, that cold touch lingered in my thoughts. I avoided going back to the cafe for the next few days, but the itch of curiosity didn't leave. It grew stronger, gnawing at me every waking moment. Something had happened at that table, something real. And as much as I wanted to forget it, I couldn't. My mind kept drifting back to that cold, invisible presence that had gripped me. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself walking through the streets again. Before I realized it, I was standing in front of the cafe. The lights were still on, and the soft chatter of late-night customers echoed from within. I stared at the familiar entrance, my heart racing as I considered going back inside. Something in me was drawn to that table, as if I needed to confront whatever had happened there. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle. A part of me screamed to turn back, to walk away and never return. But I was too far gone now. I had to know. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The cafe looked just as it always had, warm and inviting, with the soft clink of cups and plates filling the air. The waitress spotted me as soon as I entered, her expression shifting from surprise to fear. She didn't even try to stop me this time. Instead, she simply watched in silence as I made my way to the empty table. I didn't wait for permission. I pulled out the chair and sat down, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of something unusual. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal. I ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the sense of anticipation hanging in the air. I knew it was coming, the cold, the touch, the presence. I just didn't know when. As I took a sip from my cup, the room around me seemed to grow quieter, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the familiar coldness began to creep up my legs again, slow and deliberate. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table, the cup slipping from my grasp. The sensation was stronger this time, more invasive, as though something was reaching out to me, pulling me toward it. My heart raced as I glanced under the table, but once again, there was nothing. The cafe seemed to fade into the background, the sounds and sights blurring together as the cold enveloped me completely. I could feel it now, someone, standing right behind me. My skin prickled with fear, and I could barely breathe as the pressure on my shoulders returned, firmer than before. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. I was trapped in place, the weight of the invisible presence growing heavier by the second. The room grew darker, the lights dimming as though a shadow had fallen over the entire cafe. I wasn't just imagining it this time. There was something real, hovering just out of sight. The cold intensified, and suddenly, I heard it. A faint whisper, just beside my ear, too low to make out but unmistakable. It wasn't just the chill of the air anymore, there was a voice, speaking softly, but with a tone that sent shivers down my spine. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I still couldn't move. I felt paralyzed by fear. The whisper grew louder, though I still couldn't understand the words. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me, but the message was garbled, distorted. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained to listen, trying to make sense of it, but every syllable felt like a dark secret, something I shouldn't be hearing. Then, without warning, the cold hand gripped my wrist. It wasn't just a sensation this time, I could feel it. An icy, skeletal grip wrapped around me, its fingers pressing into my skin with an unnatural strength. My body jolted as if shocked by an electric current, and in that moment, I knew I had to get out of there. With a burst of adrenaline, I yanked my arm free from the invisible grip and stumbled to my feet, knocking over the chair in the process. The sound echoed through the cafe, but no one seemed to react. The patrons carried on with their conversations, oblivious to what had just happened. It was as though I were in a different world altogether. I staggered toward the door, my body trembling from the cold that still clung to me. Every step felt heavy, as if I were wading through a thick fog. As I reached for the door handle, I felt the pressure ease, and just like before, the cold disappeared the moment I stepped outside. The night air hit me like a wave, warm and comforting, but I couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in my chest. I looked back at the cafe, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I knew that whatever had happened inside was very real. Something was in that cafe, something I couldn't explain. Over the next few days, I couldn't get the experience out of my mind. It haunted me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty table, felt the cold touch on my skin. The whispers, the grip on my wrist, it was all too real to ignore. I became obsessed with finding out more. I started asking around, talking to people who had been to the cafe, hoping someone else had experienced something similar. Most people dismissed it, saying they had never noticed anything strange. But a few, just a handful, paused when I mentioned the table in the corner. Their reactions were telling. They didn't say much, but their expressions told me enough. They knew something was off. I kept returning to the cafe, though I never sat at the table again. I would sit nearby, watching it from a distance, waiting for something to happen. But each time, the table remained empty, untouched, as though whatever had haunted me that night had vanished. Yet, the uneasy feeling never left me. One evening, as I sat at a different table, nursing a coffee, the waitress approached me. She looked more nervous than usual, her eyes darting to the empty corner before settling on me. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "It doesn't stop." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Once you sit there, it follows you," she said, her voice trembling. "It won't leave you alone now." I felt my heart skip a beat as her words sank in. Follow me? I had left that table behind days ago, but what if it hadn't left me? The waitress straightened up, her eyes filled with fear. "Be careful," she said softly before walking away, leaving me to sit in silence, my mind racing with questions. What had she meant? Was it possible that whatever had touched me that night hadn't let go? And if it hadn't, how could I stop it? That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, every shadow in my room suddenly taking on a new, sinister shape. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the city seemed amplified, as though something was lurking just outside my door, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. But the dreams that followed were worse than the waking moments. In my dream, I was back in the cafe, sitting at the corner table, the cold creeping up my legs once again. This time, I could see the hand, pale, thin, and bony, reaching out from under the table, wrapping around my wrist. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickly turned on the light. There was no one there, but the feeling of cold still lingered on my skin. I looked at my wrist, half expecting to see marks, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me from that cafe. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. At first, it was small. Objects in my apartment would move slightly, just enough to catch my attention. The lights would flicker occasionally, even though the bulbs were new. But soon, the disturbances grew more intense. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I'd hear faint whispers at night, the same garbled voice from the cafe. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever had touched me that night hadn't let go. It was still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I began to dread going home, staying out late in hopes of avoiding the inevitable. But no matter where I went, the cold feeling followed. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I made a decision. I had to go back to the cafe. Maybe if I confronted whatever was haunting me, it would stop. Or maybe it would consume me entirely. Either way, I couldn't live like this any longer. I needed answers. I arrived at the cafe just before closing time, the streets outside eerily quiet. The waitress was cleaning up, her back turned to me as I entered. When she saw me, her face paled. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely audible. But I didn't listen. I walked straight to the corner table and sat down. The cold returned instantly, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable touch. The whispers began, louder this time, filling the air around me with words I couldn't understand. My body tensed, but I refused to move. I needed to see this through. Suddenly, the cold intensified, and I felt the hand on my shoulder again. This time, I didn't flinch. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to see nothing. But there, standing beside me, was a figure, a shadowy, translucent shape, its face twisted into a haunting, unreadable expression. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just the table. It had always been watching, waiting for someone like me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the feeling of that cold hand tightening around my throat, pulling me into the darkness.
Story 2.
I had always found comfort in the small, unassuming cafe nestled on the corner of my street. It was the perfect escape after a long day at work, a place where I could unwind, sip my coffee, and let the world fade away. The quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the warm glow of the soft lighting gave the cafe a calming, almost serene atmosphere. I became a regular, coming nearly every evening, finding solace in the routine. But one evening, something felt different. As I sat by the window, enjoying my usual cup of black coffee, I noticed something odd. The shadows on the walls didn't seem to match the movements of the customers. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the street lamp outside casting strange angles through the window. I blinked and looked again, but the shadows continued to move in ways that didn't make sense. They twisted and stretched, even when no one was near. I tried to ignore it, dismissing the strangeness as nothing more than my tired mind playing tricks. But as the minutes passed, the shadows seemed to grow more distinct. One in particular caught my eye, a long, dark shape creeping along the far wall, moving slowly but deliberately, as though it had a will of its own. My heart started to race, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew it. I kept watching, unable to tear my eyes away from the shadow as it inched closer to my table. It moved unnaturally, like liquid darkness, shifting and bending in ways that defied logic. I looked around the cafe, expecting to see others noticing it too, but everyone was carrying on as if nothing was out of the ordinary. They laughed, chatted, and sipped their drinks, completely oblivious to the creeping shadow on the wall. My breath caught in my throat when the shadow stopped just a few feet away from me. I wanted to get up, to leave, but my body felt frozen, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't explain. The shadow lingered there, motionless for a moment, and then it began to extend, its dark fingers stretching toward my table. I could feel the temperature drop around me, a coldness that seeped into my bones. That's when I heard a soft whisper. I turned to see the waitress standing beside me, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held my coffee refill. "You see them, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. My heart skipped a beat. "The shadows," she continued, glancing nervously at the wall, "they're looking for someone." Her words sent a chill down my spine, confirming the fear that had been gnawing at me. From that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I stepped foot into the cafe. The shadows, once faint and unnoticeable, had become an ever-present part of my visits. I started coming less frequently, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the shadows were nothing more than light tricks. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, deep down, I knew the truth. Each time I returned, the shadows seemed more alive, more intent on their movements. They slithered along the walls like dark tendrils, creeping closer to where I sat. No one else seemed to notice them, only the waitress, who now avoided eye contact with me whenever I came in. I could see the fear in her eyes too, though she never spoke about the shadows again. One evening, as I sat near the window, sipping my coffee, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I looked down, heart pounding, but saw nothing. My eyes darted to the wall, and sure enough, the shadow was there, just a few feet away. It was longer now, darker, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I stood up quickly, knocking my chair back, and rushed out of the cafe without looking back. The walk home that night was unnerving. Every shadow on the street felt like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the paranoia clung to me like a second skin. Even in the safety of my apartment, the shadows seemed to linger in my mind, their unnatural movements replaying over and over in my thoughts. Sleep didn't come easy that night. My dreams were filled with dark shapes moving silently through the cafe, stretching across the walls and floor, always reaching toward me. When I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, I could still feel that cold touch on my skin. I knew I couldn't go back to the cafe, but something inside me refused to stay away. It was as if the shadows had hooked themselves into my soul, drawing me back. The next day, despite my fear, I found myself walking toward the cafe again. It was as though I had no control over my actions. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to become, pressing down on me with an unseen weight. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, carrying me back to that cursed place. When I finally stood in front of the door, I hesitated, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I stepped inside, and immediately, the familiar chill settled over me. The cafe was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered around, none of them paying attention to me. I walked slowly to my usual spot by the window, my eyes scanning the walls for any sign of movement. The shadows were there, faint at first, but I knew they wouldn't stay that way for long. The waitress brought me my coffee without a word, her eyes avoiding mine as she set the cup down. She glanced nervously at the wall behind me before hurrying away, leaving me alone with the creeping darkness. I could feel it again, that cold, eerie presence, watching me from the edges of the room. The shadows were waiting. I sipped my coffee, trying to steady my nerves, but it was no use. The shadows had already started to move, slithering along the wall like dark serpents. This time, they didn't stop at the edge of the room. They kept coming, slowly but surely, inching closer to my table. My pulse quickened as I realized there was nowhere to run. The shadows were going to reach me. The moment their dark tendrils reached the edge of my table, the air around me grew impossibly cold. I could feel their presence, like icy fingers brushing against my skin, though there was nothing visible to the naked eye. My hands trembled as I set my coffee down, unable to take another sip. I glanced around the room, hoping someone else might see what I was seeing, but no one reacted. They were all blissfully unaware. The shadows stopped moving for a moment, hovering near the edge of the table as if they were waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to get up and leave. But I couldn't. I was trapped, rooted to the spot by fear, by curiosity, by something I couldn't explain. Then, without warning, the shadows began to shift again, this time faster, more deliberate. They stretched across the table, their dark forms rippling like liquid as they reached toward my hands. I yanked them back just in time, my chair scraping loudly against the floor as I stood up in a panic. The shadows recoiled slightly, but I knew it wasn't over. They weren't done with me yet. I bolted from the cafe, not caring if I looked like a madman. My heart raced as I stumbled into the night, the cold air stinging my skin as I hurried down the street. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The safety of my home did little to calm the terror coursing through me. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and pressing my back against it as if that would keep the shadows out. I didn't go back to the cafe for weeks after that. The mere thought of stepping foot inside sent a wave of dread through me. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, the shadows stayed with me. I saw them in my dreams, always lurking just out of reach, waiting for me to let my guard down. They followed me in the real world too, creeping in the corners of my vision whenever I was alone. The waitress's words echoed in my mind, "They're looking for someone." What did she mean? And why had they chosen me? The questions gnawed at me, but I was too afraid to search for answers. I avoided the cafe, hoping the shadows would eventually forget about me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself standing outside the cafe again. I had tried to walk past it, to ignore the pull it had over me, but something drew me back. My heart raced as I stared at the familiar door, the dim glow of the interior lights casting eerie shadows on the pavement. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know why this was happening. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cafe was nearly empty, the few remaining patrons quietly sipping their drinks. I took a deep breath and made my way to my usual table, my eyes darting to the walls as I sat down. The shadows were there, waiting, just as I had feared. They seemed darker now, more defined, as if they had grown stronger in my absence. The waitress approached me cautiously, her expression one of concern and fear. She didn't say anything as she placed my coffee on the table, but I could see the unspoken warning in her eyes. I didn't need her to tell me that the shadows were still searching, still hungry. I could feel it in the air around me, the weight of their presence pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. I sat there, staring into my coffee, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. The shadows didn't move at first, content to linger on the edges of the room, watching, waiting. But as the minutes passed, they began to shift again, creeping closer to my table with each passing second. I could feel their cold presence wrapping around me, seeping into my bones like ice water. I wanted to run, to leave the cafe and never return, but I knew that wouldn't stop them. The shadows had already marked me, and no matter where I went, they would follow. I was trapped, caught in their web, with no way out. My hands shook as I picked up my cup, trying to take a sip, but my mouth was too dry, my throat too tight with fear. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. I looked around, but there was no one near me. The whisper grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words. "We see you," it said, the voice low and rasping, like wind through a graveyard. My heart stopped, and I realized the voice wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the shadows themselves. The revelation sent a shockwave of terror through me. The shadows weren't just mindless shapes, they were alive, aware, and they were speaking to me. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but it was too much. The cold presence around me intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I could feel the shadows closing in, their dark tendrils reaching for me once again. I stood up abruptly, my chair clattering to the floor as I backed away from the table. The patrons in the cafe glanced at me curiously, but none of them seemed to notice the shadows moving on the walls. How could they not see it? How could they not feel the suffocating cold that was now wrapping around my chest, making it hard to breathe? I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the handle. The whisper followed me, growing louder, more insistent. "We see you. We know you." My breath came in shallow gasps as I finally pushed the door open and staggered out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it did little to calm the terror that gripped my heart. I ran down the street, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that cafe. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. How could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? Shadows don't just move on their own. They don't whisper your name, they don't hunt you. By the time I reached my apartment, I was completely out of breath, my legs trembling from the exertion. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and double-checking that every window was sealed tight. But no matter how safe I tried to make myself feel, I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I collapsed onto my couch, my body trembling as I buried my face in my hands. The whisper was still echoing in my mind. "We know you." What did that mean? Why me? What had I done to attract their attention? No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find an answer. All I knew was that the shadows weren't finished with me. Not yet. Days passed, and I avoided the cafe at all costs. I took a different route to work, stayed inside as much as possible, and refused to even glance in its direction. But no matter how hard I tried to distance myself, the shadows followed me. I started seeing them everywhere, in the corners of my apartment, in the hallways at work, in the streets at night. They weren't as bold as they had been in the cafe, but they were there, watching, waiting. I could feel their presence, always just out of sight, lurking in the periphery of my vision. Every night, I dreamed of them, their dark shapes creeping closer and closer until I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. The constant fear, the feeling of being hunted, was wearing me down. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares were relentless. I stopped going out altogether, isolating myself in my apartment, hoping that if I stayed hidden, the shadows would lose interest. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. One night, as I sat in my apartment, staring blankly at the television, I felt the familiar chill wash over me. I didn't need to look to know that the shadows were there, lurking in the corners of the room. They had become a constant presence, always watching, always waiting. My hands trembled as I reached for the remote, turning off the TV. The silence was deafening. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something to happen. The shadows didn't move at first, but I could feel their cold eyes on me, could sense their hunger. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. The fear was eating away at me, and I was starting to lose my grip on reality. I couldn't live like this anymore. That's when I made a decision. I had to confront them. I had to go back to the cafe and face whatever was haunting me. Maybe if I did, the shadows would leave me alone. Or maybe they would finally consume me. Either way, I couldn't continue living in this constant state of fear. It had to end. The next evening, I found myself standing in front of the cafe once again. My heart raced as I stared at the door, the familiar sense of dread washing over me. I didn't want to go inside, but I had no choice. If I didn't face them now, I knew I would never be free. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cafe was quiet, almost empty. The waitress glanced at me as I entered, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and pity. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she knew why I was there. I walked to my usual table by the window, my hands trembling as I sat down. The air around me felt heavy, thick with the presence of the shadows. I didn't have to wait long. As soon as I sat down, the shadows began to move, slithering along the walls like dark serpents. They moved faster this time, more aggressively, as if they knew this was their chance. I watched in horror as they crept closer and closer, their dark tendrils reaching for me once again. My pulse quickened, and my body tensed, but I didn't move. I had to see this through. The shadows reached the edge of my table, their cold presence wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I could feel their icy fingers brushing against my skin, their dark tendrils curling around my arms and legs. My heart pounded in my chest, but I refused to run. I had come here to confront them, and I wasn't going to back down now. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "We see you," they said, the voice low and rasping, like wind through a graveyard. "We know you." I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing as the shadows closed in. I didn't know what they wanted, but I was determined to find out. Suddenly, the air around me grew even colder, and I felt a heavy weight settle on my chest. I struggled to breathe as the shadows wrapped tighter around me, their dark shapes pressing down on me from all sides. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. But then, through the darkness, I saw something, an outline, a shape within the shadows. A figure. The figure within the shadows was faint, almost indistinguishable from the darkness itself, but I could see it moving, shifting slowly toward me. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed to stretch and twist in impossible ways. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and piercing, even though it had no visible eyes. I tried to move, to stand up, but my body wouldn't obey. The shadows held me in place, their grip tightening with every passing second. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figure loomed over me. "We've been watching you," the voice rasped, though it didn't come from the figure itself. It came from the shadows, from the walls, from everywhere at once. My heart raced, panic flooding my veins as I realized there was no escape. I was trapped, caught in their web, with no way out. The figure reached out, its hand, if you could call it that, stretching toward me, long and thin, like a branch of some gnarled, twisted tree. My body went cold as its fingers brushed against my skin, and I felt a surge of dread unlike anything I had ever experienced. For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the air stilled, and the shadows seemed to freeze in place. I was suspended in that moment, caught between fear and disbelief, as the figure loomed over me. Its touch was cold, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't the icy chill of winter, but something deeper, something that seeped into my very soul. I could feel it probing, searching through my thoughts, my memories, as if it was looking for something. My mind recoiled at the intrusion, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I could feel myself slipping away, drowning in the darkness that surrounded me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure withdrew, pulling its hand away. The shadows loosened their grip, and I gasped for air, my body trembling as I collapsed against the table. The whispers started again, but this time they were softer, almost satisfied. "We found you," they said, the voice echoing in my mind. "We know who you are." I sat there, dazed and disoriented, trying to process what had just happened. My body was shaking, my heart racing, but the shadows had retreated. They still lingered on the walls, but they no longer seemed as threatening, as if they had gotten what they wanted. The figure was gone, its presence fading into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't know what to do, what to think. The shadows had been watching me, following me, but why? What had they been looking for? And what had they found? The questions swirled in my mind, but no answers came. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that cafe any longer. I needed to leave, to get away from the suffocating presence of the shadows. I stood up on unsteady legs, my hands still trembling as I gathered my things. The waitress watched me silently from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything as I walked toward the door, but I could feel her eyes on me, just as I had felt the eyes of the shadows. I didn't look back as I stepped outside into the cold night air. I walked down the street, my mind a haze of confusion and fear. The night was cold, but it was a different kind of cold than the one I had felt in the cafe. This was natural, something I could understand, something I could deal with. The cold I had felt in the presence of the shadows was otherworldly, something far beyond my comprehension. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and the cafe as possible. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The shadows had found me, they knew me, and I had a sinking feeling that they weren't done with me yet. Eventually, I made it back to my apartment. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the windows and making sure everything was secure. But no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The shadows were still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew that it was only a matter of time before they came for me again. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Every shadow I saw, every whisper of wind, sent my heart racing. I couldn't escape the feeling that they were still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The shadows had left their mark on me, and no matter where I went, they would follow. I stopped going outside altogether, retreating into the safety of my apartment. But even there, I couldn't escape them. The shadows found their way in, slipping through the cracks in the walls, the spaces under the doors. They were always there, lurking just out of sight, reminding me that I was never truly alone. And now, as I sit here, writing this, I can feel their presence growing stronger once again. The cold has returned, and the whispers are louder than ever. I know they're coming for me. This time, I don't think I'll be able to escape. The shadows have found me, and I fear that soon, they will claim me.
Story 3.
I often found myself at the 24-hour diner on the corner after work, seeking a late-night meal to unwind. It wasn't anything special, a simple, old-fashioned place with worn leather booths and flickering neon lights outside. I liked it there because it was familiar, a routine I could count on after long shifts. Most nights, the diner was packed, especially around midnight. Truckers, night owls, and tired workers like me would crowd the tables, creating a lively buzz that made the place feel alive. But one evening, something felt different. The diner was unusually empty, not a single other customer in sight, except for me. The waitress, a quiet woman in her mid-30s with dark circles under her eyes, served me as she always did. She seemed even more tired than usual, her movements slower, her smile absent. It was as if the weight of something unseen pressed down on her, making her older than she appeared. As the night dragged on, I couldn't help but notice the silence. No chatter from other patrons, no clinking of plates or silverware. Just the low hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of the highway outside. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I had just come in during a rare quiet moment. I asked the waitress if business had been slow, but she didn't offer much of an explanation, just a vague nod and a mumbled "it's been like this lately." Her response only deepened my curiosity, but I let it slide, not wanting to push her. There was something off about her that night, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I ate, I noticed the clock on the wall creeping closer to midnight. The minutes seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if time itself was slowing down. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired, but a sense of unease was growing in the pit of my stomach. The waitress walked past my booth again, this time heading toward the kitchen, her footsteps barely audible on the linoleum floor. I watched her disappear behind the swinging doors, and that's when I overheard something strange. Her voice, though low, was tense as she spoke to the cook. "It's almost midnight," she said. "They'll be here soon." At first, I thought she was referring to some late-night regulars or perhaps a delivery truck. But there was something in her tone that made my skin prickle. Her words were laced with an apprehension I hadn't noticed before. The cook didn't respond, and the quiet that followed made the hairs on my neck stand up. I strained to hear more, but their conversation quickly ended. The kitchen went silent, and I was left sitting there, feeling like I was suddenly intruding on something I wasn't meant to hear. I glanced at the clock again. It was just past midnight now, and the air in the diner had grown noticeably colder. The silence felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I looked around the diner, my eyes scanning the empty booths and bar stools. The usual warmth of the place had faded, replaced by a cold stillness that made the walls feel closer, as if the space itself was shrinking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A sudden, sharp sound echoed from the kitchen, a clattering of pans, followed by a muffled curse. I tensed, my heart racing as I listened, half expecting the waitress or the cook to emerge and explain the noise. But no one came. The doors to the kitchen stayed closed, and the sound faded into the oppressive quiet once more. I considered leaving right then, but something held me in place. Curiosity, perhaps, or the strange allure of the mystery that was slowly unfolding. I couldn't just walk away, not yet. So, I stayed, sipping my now lukewarm coffee and trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread building inside me. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I was alone in the diner, or at least I thought I was. But then, just as the clock struck 12:30, I heard it, heavy footsteps, coming from somewhere deep in the back. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the dead silence of the restaurant. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps didn't sound like they belonged to the waitress or the cook. They were heavier, more deliberate, and there was something unnatural about the way they moved, like whoever, or whatever it was, didn't belong here. I could feel the air around me grow colder with each passing second. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe someone else had come in without me noticing, or perhaps it was just the sound of the building settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something else was in the diner, and it was getting closer. The footsteps continued, growing louder, until they stopped just outside the kitchen doors. I stared at the swinging doors, half expecting them to burst open. But they didn't. Instead, the silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body tense, as I waited for something, anything, to happen. A soft whisper echoed through the room, so faint that I thought I had imagined it at first. But then it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a language I recognized, just a string of strange, unintelligible sounds, as if someone, or something, was speaking from the shadows. My blood ran cold, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wanted to leave, to bolt for the door and never look back, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by fear. It was as if the very air around me had turned to stone, trapping me in place as the whispers grew louder, closer, until they seemed to fill my mind completely. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning in the oppressive stillness of the diner. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and frantic in my ears. I kept my eyes fixed on the kitchen doors, terrified of what might come through them next. Finally, the waitress reappeared, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look at me as she moved quietly through the diner, her steps slow and deliberate, like someone going through the motions without really being there. I tried to speak, to ask her what was going on, but my voice caught in my throat. She stopped at the counter, her back to me, and I could hear her muttering something under her breath. The words were too quiet for me to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, fear. Whatever was happening here, she was just as scared as I was, if not more. And that terrified me even more. Suddenly, the footsteps returned, louder and more distinct this time. They echoed through the diner, coming from the hallway that led to the restrooms and storage area. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned toward the sound, my body rigid with fear. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone, or something, was coming. The waitress's muttering grew more frantic, her hands gripping the counter tightly. She still didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the growing tension in the room. It was as if she was bracing herself for something inevitable, something terrible. I wanted to call out to her, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. And then, I saw it, a shadow, moving at the far end of the hallway. It was tall and indistinct, like a figure made of smoke or mist. It hovered there for a moment, just out of reach, before slowly advancing toward me. The air grew colder with each step it took, and I felt a sharp, icy chill crawl down my spine. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and twisting as it approached. I couldn't make out any details, but there was an unmistakable malice in the way it glided forward, silent but relentless. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the table, desperate for something solid to hold onto. I glanced at the waitress, hoping for some kind of reaction, but she remained where she was, her eyes downcast, her body tense. It was as if she was deliberately ignoring the thing that was coming toward us, as if acknowledging it would make it more real. The whispers had returned, soft and insistent, echoing in my mind. I don't know what possessed me to stay. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that diner as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot, as if I was bound to that place by some invisible force. I couldn't leave, not yet, not until I understood what was happening. The shadow was only a few feet away now, and I could feel the cold radiating off it, an unnatural chill that made my skin prickle. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, something rational to cling to, but nothing made sense. This wasn't something I could explain away with logic or reason. This was something else, something far darker. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light, its form wavering like a reflection in a pool of water. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unfeeling. It watched me, as if waiting for me to make the first move, to acknowledge its presence. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my voice stolen by fear. The whispers were louder now, filling the room with their eerie, disjointed cadence. I could feel them seeping into my mind, twisting my thoughts, making it harder to think clearly. All I could do was sit there, trapped, waiting for whatever came next. As the whispers swirled around me, I finally mustered the courage to look directly at the shadow. It seemed to pulse and breathe, its form almost alive, as if it were made of darkness itself. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and a sense of dread enveloped my entire being. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel panic rising within me. The waitress, still standing at the counter, finally turned her head slightly. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the fear etched deeply into her features. "You need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers. "You don't want to be here when they arrive." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I didn't want to leave her behind, but something deep inside me knew I couldn't stay. I glanced back at the shadow, which was now inching closer, its presence overwhelming. I could feel a pull toward it, a dark curiosity battling against my instinct to flee. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, breaking the tense atmosphere. The sound snapped me back to reality, and adrenaline surged through my veins. The waitress flinched at the noise, her eyes widening as she glanced toward the kitchen doors. "They're here," she murmured, fear lacing her voice. I could see the panic etched across her face, and it fueled my own. I couldn't wait any longer. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and made my way to the exit. But as I moved, I felt an icy grip on my ankle. I looked down to see the shadow stretching toward me, tendrils of darkness coiling around my leg, pulling me back. "Please, don't go," the waitress cried out, her voice desperate. "You don't understand." Her plea fell on deaf ears as I fought against the pull, panic clawing at my throat. I could feel the shadow tightening its hold, its energy seeping into me, chilling my very bones. With a surge of determination, I yanked my foot free and stumbled toward the door. I reached for the handle, my heart pounding in my chest, but just as I was about to turn it, the kitchen doors swung open. A gust of cold air rushed out, and I froze at the sight before me. The cook stood there, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He was backing away slowly, and behind him, I could see dark shapes moving in the kitchen. They were indistinct, but I could make out multiple forms, their edges blurring into the shadows that danced along the walls. They looked like distorted versions of human figures, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Get out," he shouted, his voice trembling. "You need to leave. Now." I felt the urgency in his tone, the fear that radiated from him, and it pushed me forward. I turned the handle and yanked the door open, stumbling into the night air outside. The sudden rush of cool air hit me like a wave, grounding me for a moment. I looked back at the diner, its neon sign flickering ominously, casting an eerie glow across the parking lot. I could still hear the whispers, echoing in my mind, but they were fainter now, fading as I stepped further away from the diner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside. The shadow loomed just beyond the threshold, its presence lingering in the doorway like a dark sentinel. I hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the instinct to save the waitress and the cook, who were still trapped inside. "Help us." The waitress's voice pierced through the night, a raw plea that made my heart ache. But I knew I couldn't go back. I was no match for whatever malevolent force resided in that diner. I took a step back, my body screaming to run, to escape whatever nightmare awaited me within those walls. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I sprinted away from the diner. The sounds of the night enveloped me, crickets chirping, the distant hum of traffic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were pursuing me. I glanced back once, the diner receding into the darkness, its windows black and empty, but I could still sense something lingering, waiting. As I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I finally unlocked the door and slid inside, locking it behind me as if that would keep the darkness at bay. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but the fear still gripped me tightly. I looked up at the diner one last time, the neon sign flickering like a dying star, and in that moment, I could have sworn I saw the waitress standing by the window, her eyes pleading, her face pale against the darkness. I wanted to help her, to rescue her from whatever horrors awaited inside, but I knew I was powerless. I started the engine, the familiar rumble providing a small comfort. As I pulled away, I could still feel the weight of the diner pressing against my mind, the whispers fading but never truly disappearing. I drove for miles, trying to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every shadow that flitted past my window felt alive, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind me, but all I saw was the empty road stretching out into the darkness. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I tried to convince myself that I had escaped, that I was free, but the memories of that night haunted me. The fear in the waitress's eyes, the chilling presence of the shadow, and the whispers that echoed in my mind. It was as if I had stepped into a world I didn't understand, a world where darkness reigned and the line between life and death blurred. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto my couch, breathing heavily. My heart raced as I replayed the events of the night in my mind. I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, echoing through my thoughts. They taunted me, reminding me of the danger I had narrowly escaped. Sleep eluded me that night, and every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. I kept my lights on, trying to drown out the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. The thought of returning to that diner, of facing whatever had lingered there, sent waves of nausea through me. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to put the experience behind me. I avoided the diner, taking different routes home and choosing other places to eat. Yet, no matter how far I ran, the memory of that night lingered, like a specter haunting my every step. I felt like a prisoner in my own mind, shackled to the fear of what I had witnessed. One night, I received a call from a friend who wanted to meet for dinner. Hesitant at first, I finally agreed, needing a break from my spiraling thoughts. We chose a restaurant far from my usual haunts, hoping to distract ourselves from the chaos of life. As we chatted over plates of food, I felt a sense of normalcy return, albeit briefly. But then, as if summoned by my thoughts, the diner reared its ugly head in my mind. I found myself glancing at the clock, expecting to see the hands inching toward midnight. The sense of dread returned, heavy and suffocating, as memories of that night flooded my thoughts. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. After dinner, we decided to take a walk. As we strolled, I found myself staring down the streets, half expecting to see the familiar neon sign of the diner glowing in the distance. I shivered at the thought and quickened my pace, desperate to leave that part of my life behind, but my attempt at normalcy shattered the moment I passed by the diner. The flickering lights pierced through the darkness like a beacon, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Against my better judgment, I stopped, my heart racing as memories flooded back. I felt a mixture of fear and curiosity, a battle waging within me. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the memory of the waitress's terrified eyes, the shadow lurking in the corners. My friend noticed my hesitation and turned to me, confusion etched on his face. "You okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. "Yeah, just a memory," I replied, forcing a smile. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I could feel the shadow reaching out to me from within the diner, its whispers beckoning me to return. I fought against it, reminding myself of the terror I had experienced, but the urge to know the truth tugged at my insides. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running from the past, I needed closure. I took a deep breath and walked toward the diner, my friend trailing behind me, uncertainty written all over his face. As I approached the entrance, the neon sign flickered ominously, and the weight of the atmosphere grew heavier. I pushed open the door, the familiar bell ringing hollowly in the stillness. The diner was as I remembered, empty, quiet, and foreboding. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and the whispers returned, echoing in my mind as I took a step inside. I could feel the shadows lurking, waiting for me to acknowledge their presence. I turned to my friend, who looked pale and uneasy. "Let's just take a quick look," I said, forcing a smile. But deep down, I knew there was no quick look when it came to the darkness that enveloped this place. We were about to uncover secrets long buried, and I wasn't sure we were ready for what awaited us.